Good morning and welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles, the 695th Lord Mayor's Lectures. Today we have a great contribution, the future of the arts and humanities, the first 25 years of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile for World's Coffee House might help us to tackle future global challenges. This session this morning is a contribution from a Worshipful Company of Educators, and I'm delighted to be chairing today as a proud ligamen of the Educators. I'm Dr Steven Berryman. I'm President of the Chartered College of Teaching, and I'll be convening this session and moderating the question and answer time later this morning. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping from me. Here is our agenda this morning. So my brief introductions before we have a conversation between Professor Christopher Smith and me, and there'll be some time for questions before we finish. If at any point you do have any questions, please write your questions in the question box. You can do this throughout the whole webinar. And just a reminder too that all the lectures are recorded and the recording will be available in a couple of days. So let's begin, and let me introduce the speaker for today. We're delighted to have Professor Christopher Smith. Professor Christopher Smith is the Executive Chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and International Champion for UK Research and Innovation. He has been Professor of Ancient History at the University of St Andrews since 2002, and he was also Vice Principal from 2007 to 2009. Before being seconded as Director of the British School at Rome, the UK's leading humanities and creative arts research institute overseas from 2009 to 2017. He is the author or editor of over 20 books, from textual editions to museum studies, but that stat doesn't do justice to the significant contribution Professor Smith makes for the sector and the various disciplines which he represents. But good morning, Professor Christopher Smith. It's brilliant you're here. So this morning we'll be in conversation, and I will prompt and provoke Christopher with some topics pertinent to the work of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we're delighted that we're able to represent the arts and humanities in this Knowledge Miles series this morning. So I'd like to start this morning, Christopher, by looking back before we look ahead and thinking about the last 25 years. I know you've not been the Executive Chair for the last 25 years, but I know you'll have the weight of that history on your shoulders as in your role. What stands out as the most significant achievements do you feel of the Arts and Humanities Research Council as you look back at those 25 years?
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a genuine honour and delight to be part of this series. And it is very interesting looking back at 25 years of research on arts and humanities, which is something that we've been doing since, we started as humans. So we're a very small part of that very, very long history. The Arts and Humanities Research Board and then Council was set up explicitly to try to bring together the notion of all of arts and humanities. So to pull design and performing arts, the research into performing arts, into the study of more traditional disciplines, and to see that there was a real world impact of arts and humanities research. And I think when I look at the history, I'm really struck by how often we've been able to fulfill that original mission. So one of the things that we do, which I think is terrific, are collaborative PhD studentships between universities and other organizations like museums and galleries, because that has allowed people at the very beginning of their research career to be looking outside of the university and into often community and place-based organizations, community archives and so forth, and beginning to make those more available to wider proportions of society, which I think is a great thing to do. Then that's a very individual thing that we can do, and we're the only funder that really works in that space. At the other end, we're the largest scale funder in arts and humanities. So there are other funders, really important funders, the British Academy, the Leverhulme Trust, incredibly vital to the system. But we're the only funder which can fund multi-million-pound programs. And when I think of projects like Creating Communities or the One World Research Initiative, which is about modern languages, or our current work and design for a green future, a green transition, what I think you can see is that working at scale, we can bring our communities together, and we can also reach out across the science landscape. That, I think, has been the characteristic of arts humanities, able to intervene at a very local, very micro level, but then pull that out into relevance across the whole of science. So design for a green transition, for instance, is working really hard on carbon neutral bricks. Something we just don't think about very much, but if all of our bricks were carbon neutral in their production manufacture, that would actually make a tangible difference to our carbon economy. So there's those kinds of crossovers that Arts Humanities Research Council have been so good at.
Oh, fantastic. And do you feel, just to pull a little bit more out from that, do you think it's been challenging to integrate some of those disciplines that perhaps haven't engaged in research in conventional ways? I'm thinking about some of the, as you mentioned, performing arts. Has that been something that the Research Council sought to champion and somehow weave in those practice-based disciplines?
Absolutely, we have done, and I think this has not just been a kind of nice to have, it's been absolutely essential. To give just a few examples, it's because we're really interested in research about the future performance that we're then able to take theatre performers and put them into the immersive world, as we've done, for instance, with Royal Shakespeare Company, one of our independent research organisations, and investing more and more into that future of performance. So bringing again the science of technology, immersive, etc., audience statistics and so forth, and the craft of performance and research into the craft of performance. Similarly, we've invested in some really high-end technology about music performance, which has been innovative for the industry producing, but has also intervened in things like producing environments in which you can practice, as it were, if you were in a real life performance, thereby reducing stage fright. But there are spillover stage anxiety and performance anxiety. There are spillovers of that technology into other areas for better acoustics, better design of immersive environments. So it's really been critical. And I think the one thing I would say is that I think our championship of this is making others realize that actually so much research is in fact performance-based. Medics are performance-based researchers. Now we understand more because of our work about what it means to be in performance situations and to research that. That's actually having interesting connections across other disciplines.
And that's the benefit, I guess, of the council being able to interface across such a broad spectrum of interesting and complementary disciplines. Looking more now to the present day, and obviously there's a huge amount of positivity about those 25 years and the significant achievements and contributions the council is making, but we're all very aware that the current higher education landscape feels very challenged by a range of concerns that particularly seem to target the arts and humanities, and they feel particularly vulnerable when there are particular challenges in the sector. Is there more work for us to do? I think you've obviously made a good case for it so far, but I mean, is there more work for us to do to advocate for these arts and humanities disciplines so they're not always the first to be subjected to any closures or significant curriculum change? What more can we do?
Yes, I mean, it is a pretty tough environment out there for our universities generally and for arts humanities particularly. So there is work to be done, but it's complex work. And I think this is the really important message, I think, to take away. So there is an argument that you can lodge, and it's not a bad argument, that there is an intrinsic value in studying any discipline, and that includes arts and humanities. You will, as a student, as somebody studying, you get something out of that, and you will bring something back of yourself into society. But that's not just an argument about arts and humanities. So we have to understand, firstly, what are the structural conditions that are leading to these challenges at the moment, and what kinds of mitigations we can put in place. Some of the structural challenges are actually nothing to do with our disciplines. They're to do with wholesale issues around how we fund education, which are not simple to solve. and therefore we need to understand ourselves within the broader economy of universities. Some of them have to do with very specific time-specific fluctuations in overseas postgraduate numbers, which again aren't actually sitting in necessarily our subject areas, maybe sitting in other subject areas, but have an immediate impact on universities' economies. So then the question is, how do we demonstrate the necessity for universities to have a holistic spread of subjects if they're genuinely to be universities? So there's conversation to be had about the idea of the university, an old one Cardinal Newman started some time ago in the 19th century. But I think that in order for us to participate in that, we need to be able to show, not just tell, we need to be able to show how our disciplines can contribute to the education of all the students in universities. So we need to start thinking quite hard about curriculum reform and change. And that's not a failure of arts humanities, nor is it to instrumentalize arts humanities. It's to recognize that actually the structure of university education right now is probably facing some pretty significant upheavals. And those are generational, and they're not just United Kingdom. If you go into most university systems across the world, there will be these conversations to a greater or lesser extent. And I don't think we should think somehow that we're being targeted, rather that we have the agency now to recognize the contribution that we make, to show it better, and to change in ways that we will make our disciplines more connected and more integrative for a 21st century workforce. I think that work is really important, but we've got to get, I think, beyond just sitting at the level of saying you can't not have X subject at this university, and into a university needs to be a place in which this kind of education, in which arts and humanities is fundamental, takes place. That shift is, I think, our challenge over the coming months, because it is quite tight, but also then setting the basis for a sustainable future.
And this sounds like a brilliant challenge for the City of London in a way, because I suppose it certainly inhabits all of these in its infrastructure, with the Barbican Centre at its heart, as well as being financial and obviously education as well. So there's something about the City of London could take the lead on how we demonstrate the value and the validity. And just to pull a bit more on the thinking about the British Academy and the SHAPE initiative. And I know obviously that was something that was launched during the challenges of the pandemic. And I wondered if that had been lost. I wonder if you had any comments on that British Academy's, I suppose it felt something of a reaction to the dominance of STEM, which has been hugely important in education, because I know people have been trying to address some of those underrepresentation in such a sector. But I wonder, did you want to mention any more about the British Academy SHAPE endeavour?
So the British Academy has done lots of really exciting work. Some of it actually relates to your first point, which is about how you speak to the City of London. Both the British Academy and AHRC in different projects have shown how arts and humanities feeds in very effectively into business careers, into industrial careers, into the way in which businesses stay ahead. So that conversation about how, for instance, the importance of story is critical, narrative is critical to how businesses succeed, critical to how advertising works, etc., is one way of showing that we are really contributing. And I think there's a conversation absolutely with the City of London about how we really show that the kinds of things that arts and humanities bring are hugely significant to our fiscal thinking and our fiscal futures, which takes us to the STEM and SHAPE thing, which is, I think, the British Academy SHAPE campaign, which still goes on, is really valuable in gathering together, as it were, a kind of giving an umbrella under which we can start to do things like, for instance, recruit students. So STEM has been very successful at making the case for the recruitment of students into STEM subjects. SHAPE needs to now do the same to ensure we're getting a pipeline of students, undergraduates, that will then become the research leaders of the future, and also will contribute to all the other sectors. But I think there's something also to be said about seeing a triangle rather than a dichotomy or a dualism. So I think the triangle is STEM plus shape makes science. And it's that synergy which I think we need to focus on. I think that at the moment, so much of what we see is the convergence of disciplines. You can't do medical interventions without thinking about ethics and without thinking about society. You can't introduce AI or technology without thinking about its ethical concerns. You can't think about the climate without thinking both about the mitigations you need to make through really clever science, but also about behavioral studies into how we can be persuaded to behave better, but also thinking about equitability. So what are the trade-offs and balances, thinking through those, how I should behave as a white male in a privileged society, as opposed to somebody who is in the global majority countries. These aren't separable. It isn't that you can just lodge a historian or a philosopher into a science project, or for that matter, a chemist into a humanities project. Actually, science requires us to build ecosystems that are much more joined up and much more convergent. So I think what I'd love to see is a sort of a very integrative STEM and shape conversation where there are lots of things bleeding STEM into shape into STEM, and then that being part of a really holistic view of what science is. We get there, that would be better for absolutely everybody, including scientists, because it will actually give richer, fuller, more sustainable and more responsible science, and that's really what we're after right now.
That's a brave proposal, but hopefully the City of London might take on such a challenge. Thinking now, those pre-higher education, we know that obviously as a consequence of, well, the reaction in the higher education sector and the various changes there are obviously a consequence of other sectors and what's happening before higher education. But I wonder, we know that the pipeline from school through to particularly the creative industries and research continues to be challenged too by, again, a range of conflicting agendas. Do you feel there's more work for us to do to make a more coherent path for the arts and humanities from childhood to the various industries and research? Is there more we should be doing to connect this?
Yes, I think there is. I think it's very interesting that we're now having the debate about advanced British standard. And about a curriculum change at school level, which might give richer and more holistic pathways. So I think we need to think about this in sort of two ways. So one is, what do we need to be teaching about arts and humanities, and how do we see that path through in and of itself intrinsically? And I think there's a whole bunch of stuff there about the need for the capacity to be able to express oneself, the capacity to be able to really interpret very carefully what we read and what we see, the improvement of our literate and visual imagination, but also our literate and visual analytical capacity, the freedom to express in all of the genres of performance and creativity. All of that drives them forward into pretty much any kind of undergraduate degree, actually, but obviously into the specialist disciplines. But the ability to tell a story and tell a story well is as important for somebody who's going to be a creative writer as it is for somebody who's going to write a policy brief, as it is for somebody who's going to write an article for a science journal about what they've discovered. So we need to be really strong about showing that you need to be immersed in arts and humanities to have the skills which are necessary then for a whole range of other things.
And do you feel that...
It's also true of numeracy. Sorry, it's also true of numeracy as well, I would say. But then what we need to be able to do is actually really pull the sense of the way that all of those careers will, throughout one's life and throughout continual professional development, you'll still be going back and picking up. You should be able to go back into the whole richness of our cultural and scientific world at any point. And if you cut things off too early, then that is cut off for life. And that seems to me the case that we want to make. But, school, but then school for life, and then arts, humanities, for arts, humanities, but arts, humanities for life and for science. Sorry, Steve.
Oh, no, sorry, I nearly cut you off. And that was a really important point. I wonder, though, is there a risk as we make this case of this, I suppose, this synergy of various and synthesis of various disciplines? Are we going to lose specialization? Are we going to lose those who really specialize in a particular discipline, be it the arts or humanities? Do you think that interdisciplinarity or whatever words we might use, do you think that might erode some of the disciplines and some of the expertise that we might want to retain?
So I think here, this is where really clever design, something AHRC champions, is necessary, because somehow or another we design our interventions in systems quite often to become zero-sum games, or to become either-ors, so that we end up in a situation which says something like, either you can be very good at a discipline and quite bad at a lot of other things, or you can be marginally good at quite a lot of things but not very good in anything. And we kind of make it almost feel as if there's nothing in between those. And there is, because first of all, there is something about, what are the specialisms of the future? And they may not be the same as the specialisms of the past, so there will be new specialisms. Scientists tend to be quite good at shifting the focus of where specialism is, which doesn't mean they lose the past, but they just refashion and rethink. But I also think that there's always going to be a place for those that are driven and gifted, or should always be a place for those that are driven and gifted, to be able to make other things revolve around a center of concern. So I'm a Roman historian. I study the beginnings of Rome, and I don't actually, as the survey said, always every day think about the Roman Empire. I actually think about much earlier things. I think about the beginnings of Rome in the early Iron Age. But I often find myself, because I've studied it, going back to that and finding that I can draw lessons from it. But I'm now sitting in a body that funds science across the entire waterfront, and also innovation across the globe. I can do both of those things, and I think we know that people who carry a disciplinary specialism and disciplinary capacity can use that as the solid ground from which they lead elsewhere. I never forget Deborah Bull, Baroness Bull, pointing out how many dancers are incredibly good leaders, because they have learned from their dance to be good in lots of other fields of work and engagement with human beings. And she was talking about the moment where choreographers move from being out the front to coming into the corps de ballet and lead from within, and that thinking, that's a specialism, a rigor, a discipline, but it's applicable elsewhere. So I think we can design interventions in our system that allow specialism to exist alongside transdisciplinarity. But as I said in response to an earlier question, this isn't simple. It's complex. It's hard work. And that, I think, is what we have to grasp. Many of us would love there to be easy solutions, and often we think that you could be about to snap a finger and suddenly the intervention's there. Education, what we do in an education with a 5-year-old now, will have an impact for the rest of their life, and that means these days for a century. We need to think over those long terms. We need to make this an active, iterative conversation that is highly inclusive, in order to avoid exactly the kind of trade-off situation that you're describing, and is, of course, for me a worry, as it is for us all.
And thinking now about the future and potential other worries that might come up, then congratulations on your renewed appointment as the executive chair of AHRC. What does the next 25 years look like, do you feel? And obviously, do you feel addressing the promise of technology? And you've referred to some of the work that's been going on, be that artificial intelligence and other things. But has that been the most pressing priority, do you think, for the time ahead for the Research Council to address? Is it technology, or was there other things that you feel are going to be future priorities?
So obviously, the speed of generative AI is striking, so we're all grappling with that. But what I actually think is that generative AI and the associations in technology are a problem and an opportunity for society. And it is, after all, it's a man-made technology which will be deployed by humans in society. So what we actually always need to focus on is society. We need to focus on our capacity to be a society that can adapt to change. And this notion of resilient, healthy society seems to me to be the permanent bedrock of what we've done in AHRC and what Arts and Humanities is really good at, because it's about looking at anything that comes along from a kind of situated or embedded point of view. What does this mean for me as a human being? What can I contribute to it? What is my perception of it, and how can that change? So for me, I want to think about arts and humanities contributing to a healthy world, and that means healthy in terms of our body and mind, but also healthy in our capacity to respond to change. I think fundamental to a healthy world is being able to understand the value and excitement of science, curiosity about the world, and that applied to change the world, but done so responsibly and equitably. And I think to get there, what we need, all of us, is to be able to develop a creative growth. So growth of our sectors, growth of ourselves, growth of our industries, responsibly and equitably, but creatively, so we can actually forge a new path. After all, what Arts and Humanities does, we enable ourselves, empower ourselves to imagine a new future. And that will include AI, but it will also include all the other challenges and all the other opportunities that we have. So yes, AI, really important tool, very exciting, I think lots of opportunities, but let's embed it within those real focuses on a healthy world and society, a world and society that's empowered by science equitably and creatively, and that grows responsibly towards a creative future.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you very much for the conversation this morning. And I think you've sparked a lot of curiosity, as we have some really good questions now. I'm going to tackle in the question box a chance to can see some contributions. So I'm just going to read out these comments. So thank you, John Wood, who was a past chief executive of another research council when the AHRB became the AHTC, and he was invited then, Chief Executive David Eastwood, to the Rutherford Appleton lab, where they discussed what they could do together, from digital humanities to artists and musicians and residents. They did a lot of work with the British Library. He's now a consultant with CERN, where there's a very active arts program, including involving performing arts students with their innovation program. How do you see, Christopher, how do you see how the science and technology research infrastructures can work more closely together for further mutual benefit? You might have said a bit about that, but do you want to respond?
Let me give a really concrete example. So thanks, John, that's great. Our research into conservation heritage science was about a 70, 80 million pound investment, which is collaborative with museums and galleries across the United Kingdom. The central headquarters of it is going to be in Daresbury, which is one of the key centres of the Science and Technology Facilities Council. And we're putting it there because we want to pull together all of that amazing heritage and conservation community alongside the fantastic capacity to analyse materials that happens in Daresbury, bring it together in one place. It's a really exciting combination. And I'll go for another one. Digitising scientific collections. With the Natural History Museum, we're working to pull together the scientific collections across the UK and digitise them, not just for the sake of the resilience of the sector by having them digitised, but because that will drive better science. We know that having interoperable digitised systems and collections will allow us to think more creatively about pandemics, about sustainable foods for the future, about interventions pharmaceutically, etc. But it's because we think about collections and we think about the way that collections must speak to each other that we can then work with scientists and bring this together. I could keep going, but those are just two very recent announcements. Rich's fairly recent, but Disco was launched by the Secretary of State at the Natural History Museum just a week ago, and it's £150 million, far more than AHRC could do itself, but done because we're collaborating across UKRI.
Gosh, exciting. I'm sure that's satisfied John's query. Thank you, John. And Graham Elliott, whereas London is part of a worldwide education framework, doesn't it have a differential advantage in arts and culture, which ought to be maximised by investing in this specific strength? Question mark.
So I think there is a differential advantage. I think we need to use that responsibly and equitably, and I'm sure that Graham meant that. But what I'm really interested in right now is a much deeper, sharper, and more active conversation about what we do around educational technology. So EdTech or EduTech is an interesting sphere. I think it's been effective to a point, and it has been profitable to a degree, but I'm not sure that we've really come to grips with what it could really do. But where we have the advantage, which we can use as force for good, is all those wonderful collections that we've got, all those cultural resources and assets which Graham's referring to, put into the context of responsibly and equitably delivered educational technology could be amazing. And I don't think that we're actually gripping this enough. I agree therefore with Graham that there's a strategic advantage, if you like, but it's also a force for good advantage. Let's take what we've got. Let's take the way that we can make that available responsibly in all of those things about, making sure that you represent all portions of the population fairly, that you, in any data gathering you're doing through educational technology, you're not using any discriminatory mechanisms, etc., that you're fair in the way that you use the personal data, all of that, and use that across the world. It could be extraordinary. We have led so often in educational developments for good. This is one where we should be grabbing that AI opportunity that you mentioned, Stephen, and deploying it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Graham for the question. And Janet Reynolds asks, you'd mentioned, Christopher, that this conversation around all these conversations we've had today is not unique to the United Kingdom. What can we learn from other countries about how to best to meet the challenge? And this, I think, refers to when we were talking about the higher education sector and the various challenges the disciplines have. What can we learn from abroad?
It's not dodging the question to say the first thing we can learn is that there isn't a simple answer. It would be lovely if you could just sort of look over at, Ruritania as a kind of imaginary kingdom and say, oh, look, they've got it right. Why don't we do it like that? Actually, I think whichever educational system you look at, you find that there are real challenges. Some of them are pertinent to local situations of geography and resource. Others are structural and similar to ours. There is clearly an issue around mechanisms and models of investment in education across the piece, where there are some challenging aspects of the statistics when you look at them. It appears that you could say that we underspend, but it's also the case that we appear to have very expensive education, and it's not clear why the education is so expensive or what it is doing for being so expensive. Now, I'm not being critical of anybody here. The data, I think, is messy in every country. I think one of the things, though, that when I when I look across, those countries which I think are perhaps tackling this most effectively are the ones for whom the fundamental value of education, and I don't mean a particular education in X, I just mean in education, and the recognition that you need long-term strategies with minimal short-term interventions to cope, to actually design a system and then track it through. Those seem to me to be having the most interesting conversations at the moment. We're not far off that. We shouldn't do ourselves down. There are some really serious bits of thinking that are going. Stephen, you led some really important work around the music curriculum. So we are having those conversations, but it requires us to take the baseline, the value of education and the value of thinking long term are, I think, those things that unite countries that are facing these challenges well, differentiate perhaps from countries that are bouncing around from, let's try this, oh, that didn't work over in a year, now let's try that, because that's not the way to actually approach education, that we know.
Thank you, and thank you to Master Educator for the question. Eric Tracy now is challenging me with a word which I'm going to try and pronounce correctly, but we'll all. So he mentions a friend of his, one of the world's top econometricians. I wonder if I said that correctly. Tells many of his PhD students that to be a great econometrician, they had better learn to write properly, and recommends reading to them, such as Churchill. Is he an outlier in this, or do many academics behave like this?
So when I sit with the other chairs of the research councils, with Ottilie Laser, who's the CEO of UKRI, and we chat about what you need to write, to produce well, we always come back to the fact that good writing and a good, strong narrative is essential to any effective piece of science. And that's true of science communication, which is sort of more policy and public facing, as it is for getting your article into Nature or the highest ranking journal, whatever it is. So I think that's absolutely spot on. Read lots, practice writing, care about narrative. That's always the answer.
Thank you. And that mention of narrative kind of weaves beautifully to a question from Anthony McLaren. We have never been more saturated with acts of communication and narrative, fueled by the near universal use of information technology and smartphones. An epidemic of poor mental health is following in the wake. And I know there was a recent book published, John Haidt, I think, about this very much rewiring of children's brains. How should the arts and humanities be stepping up to this challenge of mental health and epidemic of mental health?
So I used the phrase "healthy world" when I was thinking about the future, and I really do think that we have a huge responsibility to engage with this. So we have a multi-million-pound project on mobilising cultural and natural assets to tackle health disparities, and in part what that is doing is actually saying that there are some fundamental things which are inequitably distributed across society, which are some of the things you really need to have a bedrock of mental health, and that includes very much kind of cultural and natural assets that we've been talking about, access to theatre, access to artistic opportunities to be creative, access to the outdoor world and the understanding of nature, which is as much a kind of me in nature as a nature as science conversation, and the two need to come together. So I think that this is absolutely right, and one of the most powerful things that we did during the COVID epidemic, Paul Crawford did an extraordinary piece of work with Aardman Animations called "What's Up With You," which was about children who were suffering from isolation and feelings of an absence of self-worth, particularly as they went into lockdown. Which reached millions and millions of children, a remarkable piece of combination of health and creative industries. So I think this is absolutely right. Of course, the challenge is that it would be lovely to think that we could step up to give the answer, what I want to say is where we need to step up is to frame intelligently the conversation. This, I think, is the thing that arts humanities must really hold on to. This is why I don't think it's instrumentalizing arts humanities to put it into these debates. It would instrumentalize it if we were asking ourselves to say, well, the answer is only use your phone for 2.5 hours or whatever it might be. And that might come out of some behavioral conversations or whatever. What we need to be able to do, and I think have done in some respects here, is frame the debate, frame the discussion. We have been talking about loneliness, isolation, about the differing paces of information retrieval, cognition, about the changing habits of reading, not only over the past 5 years, but over hundreds of years. There are numerous moments in which people in society have felt isolated and found communication incredibly difficult. The well of loneliness, I mean, there's so many examples that you can come up with, which we have studied and examined and then thought about. So we're in a perfect position to frame a conversation. What is good for society? How can we talk about what is good for society? And I think that there is one conversation which I really would want us to have, which is, how do we revalue conversations that take place over a long period of time? So social media is incredibly helpful for all sorts of things. I've learned such a lot from, what used to be called Twitter and other things, and made, acquaintances and friendships. Stephen, I think you and I first exchanged views on that medium. So there's lots of good things there. But it doesn't allow for a long conversation, and it doesn't allow for a conversation that's framed in terms of seeing the other person's, seeing the problem from somebody else's point of view, living it through somebody else's eyes. And that is what we need if we're going to tackle long-term problems. That's actually the classic version, I think, what arts humanities does when it teaches reading. When it teaches reading, whether that's reading through performance, reading through music, reading a situation, it's having to see it through multiple lenses and give them weight, but then be discriminating. So yes, we need to step up to that conversation for sure.
And thank you. And I know there's lots of fantastic other questions, but time is sadly against us. And you reiterate your point, really, but we need to have that longer term conversation. And I guess so many of our structures are based in the short term. But I hope that our Lord Mayor, even despite his year of office, he might consider what arts and humanities might do for this conversation for many, many Lord Mayors to come beyond. But thank you so much. I am afraid that is the end of the questions, but thank you so much, everyone who also had a chance to contribute a question this morning. And just now, to have a brief look at the forthcoming lectures in the series, you can see there's one tomorrow already, Intellectual Curiosity. So much has been raised on the Curious today. You might be tempted by that, and there's 2 more coming up in April. But firstly, thank you to everyone this morning, the audience, for joining and your interest and your very rich engagement. All thanks, though, to Professor Christopher Smith insights this morning. I know the various disciplines and sectors you work with very much are grateful for your leadership and how you champion the value of the arts and humanities in our ever-changing world. Hopefully a healthier one awaits us all, and I hope that the city will embrace the potential to keep this longer term conversation going. But thank you so much. This lecture and all lectures are recorded and posted on the YouTube channel in case you'd like to revisit anything, and we hope to see you all again soon for another lecture in the Knowledge Mile series. Thank you very much and goodbye.